ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to凱達格蘭Forum 2021. Hope you had a good rest. There will be two panel discussions in this afternoon. The panel discussion 3 is responses to gray zone coercion in the East and South China Seas. Now let's welcome the moderator, Vice President of Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, Katie Chan. Please welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the afternoon session of the凯達格蘭Forum, Asia-Pacific Security Dialogue. This panel, we discuss the response to gray zone coercion in the East and South China Seas. Joining me today are 4 esteemed speakers. Please allow me to introduce them. First is Admiral James O. Ellis, Jr. He is the co-chairman of the National Security Task Force and also the Project on Taiwan Indo-Pacific region at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Admiral Ellis served on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, and he is also the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. Admiral Ellis also was the commander of the United States Strategic Command. Admiral Ellis's shore assignments included numerous senior military staff tours, and he once participated in the Persian Gulf War and Operation Desert Storm. His senior command positions included Commander-in-Chief at the USA Naval Force, Europe, and Commander-in-Chief at the Allied Force. He also led the United States and NATO forces in combat and humanitarian operation during the 1999 Kosovo crisis. And second speaker, we have Admiral Kawano Katsutoshi. He was the former Chief of Staff, Joint Staff of the Japanese Self-Defense Force. He also has tremendous experience in the Japan Self-Defense Force, included the 5th Chief of Staff, Joint Staff, Japan Self-Defense Forces, Chief of Staff of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces. He was also Commander-in-Chief in the Self-Defense Fleet at the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces. And he was also the Vice Chief of Staff, Joint Staff at the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. Our third speaker is Rear Admiral Ramo of the Philippines. He is currently the professor of praxis at Admiral School of Government in the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. Prior to that, he was the vice commander of the Philippine Navy at the headquarters of the Philippine Navy. And he was also the commander of the Naval Force West Commander Area of Operation of the Philippines. And last but not least, we have Professor Hoang Vet joining us. He is the Associate Professor of the Ho Chi Minh City University of Law from Vietnam. So without further ado, I would like to have Admiral Ellis to give us his presentation. Admiral Ellis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ms. Chen. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this year's凱達格蘭Forum and the 2021 Asia-Pacific Security Dialogue. This is an exceptional conference hosted by the Prospect Foundation on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It aims to advance cooperation with like-minded partners in the fields of regional peace, prosperity, and stability, certainly goals on which we can all certainly agree. I also appreciate being asked to participate on this panel with my distinguished colleagues. In my opinion, narrowing both the geographic focus and the specific Chinese activities of concern is essential if we're to avoid getting needlessly bogged down in rhetorical arguments that in many ways have characterized the decade-long discussion of Chinese gray zone activities. To be sure, words do matter, but even competing attempts to define the gray zone have, to some degree, polarized the conversation. I'm hearing an echo. Is coming clear to you, Ms. Chen?
Echo, so I'll have the conference staff to try to resolve the issue. Okay. Can you please continue? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm just hearing this continuing echo, and I wondered if that was the way it was sounding to everyone else.
I could hear you very clearly. So I think other speakers, do you hear an echo, or Admiral Ellis sounds okay?
Okay, so it must be on mine.
Yeah, it's on your end.
Okay, thank you.
Please, sir.
A former commander of U.S. Special Operations Command once defined gray zone operations as when groups seek to secure their objectives while minimizing the scope and scale of actual combat. It's in this murky middle that he explained we are confronted with ambiguity in the nature of the conflict, the parties involved, and the validity of the legal and political claims at stake. These conflicts defy our traditional views of war. A contrarian view holds that defining everything below the level of actual combat as gray zones creates a term that is so expansive and inclusive of economic, political, and information operations, lawfare, and just plain old coercion that is essentially meaningless for navigating the continuum from debate to strategy to implementation. Again, I applaud the organizers of this panel for bringing specificity, focus, and hence clarity into the conversation. It lends itself to better addressing the significant risks involved, both in the Chinese strategy and in creating counters to it. As an old Navy fighter pilot, over many decades, I've used the same template for dealing with risk, whether it was in aircraft carrier operations, the Taiwan Straits crisis of 1996, in which I participated, the Kosovo conflict of 1999, and as you've heard, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I call it the 4M approach. To effectively deal with any risk, the challenges facing our national security leadership remains as they has always been in addressing risk. How do we measure it? How do we minimize it as much as possible? How do we manage the risk that remains? And finally, how do we mitigate the outcome if our efforts fail? As far as measuring risk, in the South China Sea, the measurement of risk is not difficult. China has pursued the classic gray zone strategy of creeping incrementalism for now nearly 2 decades, using a graduated strategy of first false declaration, then reassuring placation, and finally rapid escalation. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to figure out what went wrong here. I got a different appearance. Just a second. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Excellent. As I was saying, upon using a graduated strategy, China has effectively created and implemented a fait accompli to its neighbors in the world. Their gray zone activities in part serve as an assertion of defense for maritime claims in the East China Sea, while allowing China to expand control over disputed territories, control critical energy and fishing resources, and influence regional roles. Chinese conventional gray zone operations are primarily spearheaded by the China Coast Guard and People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. China's non-conventional capabilities remain less understood and as such carry greater risk for escalation. These also include cyber, space, electronic warfare, and influence operations, as well as military applications of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning. To minimize risk, as James Holmes and Toshi Yoshihara have noted, it's one thing to deter an aggressor from seizing ground, while quite another to evict an aggressor from ground it has already seized. Island building tactics have left China in possession of territory, and it's hard to see how such gains can be reversed short of open conflict. Beijing has, in essence, forced the region and the United States to live with new and largely irreversible strategic reality. But if redressing past grievances is not possible, certainly learning the lessons of recent history is. And as I often note, they're not lessons learned simply because you write them down. Something needs to actually change at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. A careful parsing of the Chinese strategy and a collaborative effort by those nations most impacted by Chinese actions is essential. Another key to minimizing future risk is so-called situational awareness. The knowledge that gray zone activities are taking place, much less their scope and focus, is incredibly important. At its heart, this is an intelligence function, but not solely military intelligence. As Lindsay Shepard at CSIS has written, identifying and assessing the true nature of gray zone threats is intrinsically the intelligence mission guided by the policy priorities set at the national level. Gray zone campaigns are challenging, given that warning requires detection of a weak signal through global noise and across threat vectors and regional boundaries. Such activity exists below the threshold of armed conflict, but within the bounds of competition, obscuring intent, capability, and impact. Gray zone activity is most effective when malign activity is executed within legal boundaries, so as not to set off any alarms or cross traditional warning trigger points, and this further weakens the signal. Thus, warning and minimizing risk in the gray zone means identifying and assessing new patterns throughout new sources of data, and it should also mean exposing those activities to the court of world opinion. In managing risk for custodians of the current order, it's not enough to think exclusively about the marine dimensions of strategy. To counter China's gray zone stratagems, Washington and its allies must take a page from Beijing and adapt a holistic, grand strategic posture that implies patient, vigilant, countervailing pressure on many fronts simultaneously. In short, the defenders of the status quo must themselves think in shades of gray and must accustom themselves to acting in the twilight between peace and war. To do any less would concede China the initiative and give them the ability to shape the future regional order. The efforts to counter the malign effects of China's gray zone strategy will require an increased level of collaboration by all nations affected. The partners in the region have begun to come to grips with the dichotomy they face in deciding how, or even if, to begin to resist the Chinese efforts. In a major departure from ASEAN's often calming statements on the South China Sea, in last year's ASEAN conference, for example, the chairman's statement adopted a bit of a tougher tone. It reaffirmed that the 1982 UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, is the sole basis for determining maritime entitlements, sovereign rights, jurisdiction, and legitimate interests over maritime zones. As for the specifics of what needs to be done, Lyle J. Morris described a recent RAND study that identified 9 principles of gray zone risk management that I paraphrase here for conciseness. First and most important strategic principle is that the United States, allies, and partners should not merely seek to mitigate losses in the gray zone, it should aim at gaining strategic advantage. In almost all areas of gray zone competition, the United States and its partners remain in a relatively advantageous moral and material position vis-a-vis the primary aggressors of China. The U.S., therefore, with its partners, should leverage all tools of statecraft to improve its relative position while controlling risks of escalation. In short, we need to go on the offensive rather than merely remain on the defensive, and do so in ways that, though they may be asymmetric, are consistent with our norms and values. The second principle flows directly from the first. In seeking strategic advantage, the United States should be proactive rather than reactive in its approach to the gray zone challenge. Part of the problem over the last 5 years is that we have often become too passive and ceded the initiative to China. Third, and relatedly, a core element of successful gray zone strategy is the ability to respond quickly to new provocations. The United States and its allies and partners will need to answer potential gray zone initiatives quickly and decisively without waiting weeks or even days for discussion and debate. Here is where a pre-existing coordination center and pre-planned responses could be essential. Fourth, while the United States should attempt to lead through multilateral, not just quadrilateral processes and institutions, it should be prepared for a less than unanimous response in circumstances where U.S. leadership is essential to marshal a rapid response. Leading multilaterally can be difficult because gray zone actions affect U.S. allies and partners in more direct and different ways, particularly with those who have greater national interests at stake than does the United States. Those countries will have constraints on their responses that limit any joint action. This leads to a fifth and related principle. Our responses must be aligned to the greatest extent possible with local partners. This may pose a significant constraint on U.S. actions because many states in Asia have different views about the degree of a threat posed by China, the degree of confrontation they are willing to undertake, and the level of partnership they will accept with the United States. The U.S. must therefore strike the right balance between accounting for such differing views and hesitations about escalation, with the need for more forceful responses that may deter gray zone action, but may in the process alienate possible allies. Sixth, any strategy for responding to gray zone aggression must balance excessive risks of escalation, including military, diplomatic, and economic aspects, with the reality that countering gray zone aggression demands some degree of risk tolerance in order to be effective. Seventh, gray zone tactics are symptoms of broader regional ambitions and grievances and cannot be addressed outside that context. China is pursuing specific goals and dealing with specific threat perceptions in its region. Gray zone techniques are only one tool by which they are doing so. Thus, we're not going to solve the underlying cause of the disputes, for example, sovereignty of disputed territory, with China by undertaking new or innovative low-level tactical response. But appropriate gray zone responses can buttress strategic deterrence. An eighth principle underpinning the proposed strategic concept is that China continues to value its status as a legitimate and respected member of the international system. They're not yet willing to abandon concern about such status in exchange for unrestrained aggressive opportunities in the gray zone or elsewhere. This reality provides the United States and its partners with significant leverage by making Beijing sensitive to the public costs of overly aggressive actions in these spheres and potentially vulnerable to powerful information campaigns designed to make them pay a reputational cost for such activities. And finally, as alluded to earlier, not all gray zone aggression has equal significance for the security of regional allies and partners or global norms. Hypothetically, a Chinese paramilitary assault on the Senkaku Islands would constitute a direct threat to the sovereignty of an ally, where Chinese harassment of Filipino fishermen on Scarborough Shoals, as significant as that is, may be of less immediate concern. What I'm saying is gray zone threats are not all created alike, and neither are responses to them. Some gray zone threats require immediate action, while others may require long-term persistent dissuasion through political messaging. In mitigating risk, despite the best of intentions and the concerted efforts of allies and partners in the region, a strategy of appropriate pushback, much less confrontation with China, is not and cannot be risk-free. Looking to the future, then, civilian leaders and military officials should be careful not to overstate the ingenuity or cleverness of gray zone strategies. Yet they should also bear in mind that their own efforts, carefully employed, will go far in determining whether gray zone strategies primarily bring payoffs or blowback for the states that employ them. An appropriate risk mitigation focus is the provision to the operating forces of the tools they may need to succeed. This should include expanding the role of white-hulled ships in the same manner that China has increasingly militarized the use of its Coast Guard. A formal regional integration of Coast Guard or equivalent maritime patrol capabilities is preferable to a collection of classic gray-hulled warships, as it begins the conversation at a different level with legitimate maritime, policing, and fishery patrol legal authorities. The second area of risk mitigation is a rigorous and extensive review of the rules of engagement, especially as they apply to potential gray zone confrontations. While these guidelines can never be prescriptive or exhaustive, they need to be principle-based, broadly applicable, and rigorously trained to. The judgment of the commanders on the scene must be relied on, but it should be enhanced by extensive preparation in the form of free-form exercises and interactive red teams long before the possible first encounters. The third option to consider is the immediate incorporation of non-lethal capabilities in vessels engaged in freedom of navigation and other sovereignty patrols in the East and South China Seas. It is a fact that we are dispatching units into potential gray zone confrontations equipped primarily with systems designed solely for the lethal high-end battle. Other so-called intermediate force capabilities with often reversible effects would at least provide commanders an alternative where lethal force is often not the desired or appropriate first response. In conclusion, I once again turn to Lyle Morris, who says persuasively, China is increasingly turning to maritime coercion through unconventional means in East and Southeast Asia. Tactics that have traditionally fallen into binary categories of military and non-military coercion to achieve state ends no longer lend themselves to conventional constructs of analysis. The concept of a gray zone between war and peace in Asia is now a challenge that states in the region must take seriously and adopt strategies to counteract. Yet the United States and its allies and partners still arguably adopt traditionalist thinking more often in assessing and responding to the threat. The result is a playing field sharply tilting against the United States and its allies and towards China, which is blurring the means, platforms, and tactics of peacetime coercion in new and potentially destabilizing ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ellis, for your wonderful presentation and for introducing what you call the 4M approach, measuring, minimizing, managing, and mitigating. And also proposing we adopt a less traditional way of dealing with gray zone coercion in the East and South China Sea. Second, we have Admiral Kawano as our speakers. Admiral Kawano, the floor is yours. Admiral, you should unmute. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Moderator. I would like to give a presentation on my thoughts. So since outbreak of the pandemic of COVID-19, China is trying to expand its influence over the whole world using face mask, vaccine, economic assistance, and so on. Especially China disturbed Taiwan in getting vaccine by a mean risk trick. Japan is very happy to have given the vaccine to Taiwan. Under this situation, Japan-US summit meeting was held in Washington, D.C. on April, Japan Standard Time. Prime Minister Suga was the first national guest of President Biden. It was quite a milestone for not only Japan and the US, but also the world. That the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is included in the joint statement. Anyway, the front line of world security was drawn on West Germany in the Cold War. On the other hand, the front line of it moved to the first island chain, including Japan, in this era, because the US designated China as the most powerful threat. Therefore, Japan cannot avoid to stand on the world security front line, nevertheless, whether Japan likes it or not. I think that it is very clear Japan is the most important partner of the US to handle China's expansion. As a result, Japan is going to be included in the history. Japan-US security treaty originally aimed to Japan security. However, it should be developed to the alliance for creating peace and stability in this region, including Taiwan Strait, cooperating with the US from now on. In that sense, Japan must build up the defense power and expand the role of security. Moreover, the Japan-US security relationship should be put into risk and responsibility sharing from the burden sharing. The Taiwan issue should be resolved peacefully, which is an assumption. However, this issue totally depends on the China's intention. not Taiwan's and the US intention. We must consider the case that China is trying to invade Taiwan in any method when the peaceful negotiation is failed, unfortunately. In Japan, there is an opinion that Japan should take a role between US and China even in such a stage, because Japan has a tight relationship with China economically. If you do so, Japan should not request US to apply Japan-US Security Treaty Article 5 on Senkaku, I think. In case of the worst, Japan should assist Taiwan, which is our national interest. Actually, Taiwan contingency will accompany Japan's contingency at the same time. The Chinese Communist Party had a 100th anniversary on 1st July 2021. From late in 1970s to 1980s, China has moved to the open reform policy, economically becoming the second largest country in these days. In addition to that, Chinese military budget is growing up rapidly. As you know, it is 42 times for 30 years in military budget and 4 times than Japan's. I understand that the country's economic growth accompanies a maritime expansion historically. For example, Portuguese, Spanish in the age of discovery, followed by the United Kingdom, the New Zealand, United States, and Japan. And conflict happened among them, finally, because the maritime interest, including the abundant maritime resources as well as safety of the sea lane, are necessary for economic developed countries. In that sense, I completely understand Chinese maritime expansion in accompanied with his economic growth. However, the problem is Chinese how to think of international law of the sea. The sea originally is open and free, which is a concept of the international law of the sea. Therefore, HOIP means the sea is for every country and using it to develop each country. HOIP does not naturally aim to contain China. However, China drew lines on the Pacific, on the East China Sea, and on the South China Sea by their own without international agreement and is claiming their territory, which is clearly against the international law. Especially China's claim in the South China Sea was denied by the International Arbitration Court, but China ignored that judgment. Meanwhile, in the East China Sea, China has frequently intruded into Japan territory waters surrounding the Senkaku Island. This is also China's attempt to change the status quo by force or cohesion in defiance of international law. Recently, there have been cases in which China Coast Guard vessel chases Japanese fishing boat that are legitimately engaged in fishing activities. This is an infringement on Japan territorial and administrative rights. Even if China unilaterally proclaimed its sovereignty over the Senkaku Island, Japan runs the administration and has effective control of them. Hence, China's intrusion into Japan's territorial waters near the island is unacceptable. Furthermore, the world has faced the alarming situation from the viewpoint of freedom of seas navigation. It is China's enforcement on February 1st of the Coast Guard law, which stipulated respect the authority of countries' Coast Guard, including defense operation. If China upholds our shared value of freedom of the sea, we can share economic prosperity with China. Regrettably, however, China shows through its behavior that it does not share this value with us. It is difficult to make a compromise with China on this sense of value. We need not only economic power, but also military power, especially naval power, which is background to proceed with HOIP and must constrain Chinese activity in the sea. Quad, consisting of US, Australia, India, and Japan, is needed for this purpose. I think that Quad should lead Indo-Pacific countries for maritime security, including containing China for the time being. Because Quad are democratic countries as well as sharing the common value as free and open the sea. Moreover, Quad has a naval power more than certain level. In that sense, it is quite meaningful to have conducted the Malabar by Quad this year. The United Kingdom, which existed from EU, a plan to send the Queen Elizabeth battle group to Indo-Pacific, in addition to German and Netherlands naval ship. France is also a Pacific country. I believe that cooperation between Quad and the European countries will greatly contribute to maritime security, so this framework could be expanded to other countries, including ASEAN countries, gradually and enhance the maritime security in this region by it. I can say at least the multilateral network is the best way to counter China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Kawano, for your presentation and for sharing the views from Japan and proposing that multilateral network is the best way to deal with Chinese aggression in the East and South China Sea. So let's move on to Admiral Ong. It's good to see you again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Chen, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First off, China's sea control strategy drives the projection of hard power in East Asia. It covers the stretch of the waters from the Yellow Sea in the Korean Peninsula southwards to the Natuna Islands of Indonesia and all the international straits, key islands, and features in between. By attaining sea control, China aims to establish a maritime buffer to protect its heartland or mainland. In the South China Sea or in the West Philippine Sea, the PLA Navy attempts to exercise sea control using a combination of their naval, Coast Guard, maritime militia, and its island facilities in Hainan, the Paracels, and the Spratlys. On the other hand, the coercive tactics using gray zone operations is basically a means for establishing sea control. It is unique since it employs non-kinetic methods against other coastal states by using its Coast Guard and militia vessels. Unfortunately, there seems to be no applicable provisions in international law which can be used to regulate or govern their behavior. In turn, affected states fail to develop an effective rules of engagement that guide the response of their naval or maritime agencies. Thus, PLA's force of choice for establishing naval presence in the West Philippine Sea is their militia. It is non-confrontational. It anchors off in isles and features they take interest in, short of physical occupation. It gives them flexibility in terms of massing up or dispersing them, just as they did in the Juan Felipe Reef, and no Navy has yet developed a tactical solution to address them either legally or militarily. Based on my readings, the primary role of the militia is to support the PLA Navy or conduct independent operations. Its secondary role involves maritime rescue operations and assistance to maritime law enforcement. And its third role as a reserve force, it is capable of mobilizing in times of emergencies and in times of conflict. The Chinese occupied isles and features, such as those in Subi, Fiery Cross, or Mischief Reefs, enhances China's sea control strategy, complementing its naval and Coast Guard vessels. It also serves as an alternate staging base or staging point for militia vessels while away from their home province. For those isles and features occupied by my country, the Philippines, in the West Philippine Sea, China has deployed their Chinese Coast Guard. For example, in the Ayungin Shoal or Second Thomas Shoal, Chinese Coast Guard vessels have blockaded our naval ships, which they suspect of bringing construction materials to repair our lone vessel there, the BRP Sierra Madre. Lastly, the PLA Navy vessels are employed to challenge all Philippine Navy vessels, particularly those conducting presence patrols in certain areas of the Spratlys Island Group, which we call the Calayan Island Group. We see PLA Navy frigates and corvettes lurking around our Navy's established patrol and resupply routes located between mainland Palawan and our occupied islands and features, and challenging our naval vessels when the opportunity arises. For the Philippines, following the recent incident in the Julian Felipe Reef, our Coast Guard and our Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources have been the principal means of engaging against Chinese Coast Guard militia vessels, Coast Guard and militia vessels operating inside the West Philippine Sea. Notably, there were, aside from the incident in Julian Felipe Reef, there were two other incidents in Sabino Shoal, and one incident involving a PLA Navy warship in the Marie-Louise Bank. It appears that as per our recent experience, the use of our Coast Guard vessels to ward off militia vessels encroaching in our areas was effective. However, this should be taken in the context of the appeasement policy or pro-China policy of our president and the current state of relations between him and the government of China. Unilaterally, the Philippines needs to improve on its interagency collaboration between its agencies. This is to mitigate the challenges in terms of coordination and, of course, our limited number of deployable ships to the West Philippine Sea. Multilaterally, there are several actions that concerned coastal states can do to address gray zone coercive tactics of the PLA Navy, both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Ideally, and to wit, the academe and experts on international law can study how to mitigate, regulate, or counter the gray zone coercion tactics employed by the Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels. The effectiveness of these Chinese militia vessels lies in the ambiguity of its character and behavior. It is designed as a commercial fishing vessel, but it does not conduct fishing operations. Rather, it performs tasks fitted for naval vessels such as naval presence, surveillance, or shadowing of foreign naval vessels. Coast Guards of the region can organize themselves as a multilateral body similar to the West Pacific Naval Symposium, or WPNS, and develop a code of behavior and best practice in conformity to UNCLOS and other relevant international laws. The employment of the Chinese Coast Guard vessels in DEC of other coastal states complements this. Ideally, if ASEAN can get its improve on its cohesion vis-a-vis the West-South China Sea issue, joint patrols by ASEAN navies may be something we can look forward to complement the FONOPs conducted by U.S. Navy and the Quad and EU countries. Other non-military or maritime cooperative mechanisms by ASEAN agencies such as Coast Guard, Fisheries, Academic Research Group, etc., can be also conducted in the South China Sea. In summary, gray zone coercive tactic is part of China's overarching strategy to establish sea control over East Asian waters. The ambiguous nature of such tactic defies a legal definition, which make it difficult to develop an appropriate military response. The challenge before us is to determine what would be the appropriate cost to China in further continuation of such a tactic. And lastly, setting aside the diplomatic constraints of the Philippines' one China policy and the current tenor of our domestic politics, I believe that maritime security among the Philippines, Japan, and Taiwan is intertwined, as well as the fact that we share common aspirations for a democratic way of life. Somehow, we need to navigate a way to work together. This ends my presentation. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Admiral, for sharing your observation on the fishery militia from China in the East and South China Sea area, and by proposing the joint patrol by ASEAN navies in the South China Sea in collaboration with the Philippines and of course the democratic allies that honors the democratic way of life. Let's move on to our fourth and last panelist, Professor Hong from the Ho Chi Minh City University of Law from Vietnam. Professor, the floor is yours. You should unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor for me to join this forum. So today I want to share with you about the strategy to tactics in the South China Sea, experience from Vietnam. Please, okay, thank you. It is a map about the South China Sea and many disputes between 6 countries, including Taiwan, in the South China Sea. But since 2009, China has increased its aggressive actions in the South China Sea. The biggest goal of China is still monopolizing the South China Sea. However, in order to avoid reaction from the US and international community, China has used gray zone tactics to still achieve its goals without being considered armed attacks. In particular, since at the beginning of this year, China has passed the China Coast Guard law and used many fishing boats to surround Western Drift. This signals that China will continue to increase the application of this tactic in the future. The US and the Southeast Asian countries that have disputes with China in the South China Sea are having many difficulties with Beijing gray zone tactics. Many political and diplomatic issues have limited the ability of the US Navy to respond to these Chinese tactics. The Southeast Asian country have a dispute with China on the South China Sea, have not enough maritime force to counter these tactics from China. Regional organizations like ASEAN will almost certainly never be able to deal with China use of militias in the South China Sea because some Asian members are friendly to Beijing. Please, next slide for me. Yeah, Only from 2011 until now, many times China used control tactics to Vietnam on the South China Sea. In 2011, Chinese vessel cut cable of Vietnamese survey ships on the Vietnamese EEZ. And in 2012, China arrested Vietnamese fishing boats near Brussels Islands. And especially in 2014, China used an oil rig, Haiyang 981, to deploy in Vietnamese EEZ. Yeah, until now, many times, China used control tactics to Vietnam. So I want to share with you the experience from Vietnam to respond to control tactics of China with the oil rig incident in 2014. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. You can see that is oil block of Vietnam's. It is located. They are located on Vietnamese EEZ and continental shelf. But China reject all of them and used threats and coercion to stop this action. Only, but although Vietnam's only use it in explore and exploit in Vietnamese EEZ. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is many oil block Vietnam call forbid from foreign country on Vietnamese EEZ and continental shelf, but China reject all of them. China use threats and coercion to Vietnam in EEZ. Although China is a member of UNCLOS. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, China threatened two foreign oil company, for example, with the ExxonMobil with block 117, 119. Yeah, so ExxonMobil have to withdraw of Vietnam's project. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now I want to share with you experience to respond to control tactic of China with the oil rig incident in 2014. Next slide, please. Yeah. In 2014, China used an oil rig. China deployed into Vietnamese EEZ. And China only used oil rigs with many China's coral ships and many Chinese maritime militias. So As a country much smaller than China, Vietnam's maritime forces are also much smaller than China's. Next slide, please. Yeah, that is the image. The China's coral ships of China used water cannon to fire two Vietnamese ships. That is an action of Grichon tactics. Don't use military, but use coercion and threats. China can gain its goal on the South China Sea. So therefore, to protect its maritime interests against China's Great Drone tactics, Vietnam has used a combination of diplomatic and legal measures and the use of Vietnamese coral. During the oil rig incident in 2014, Vietnam maintained on the one time, Vietnam maintained its coral force fiercely clinging to the oil rig, not allowing acts such as exploratory drilling in Vietnam's EEZ. This does not provide an excuse for China to use its navy as it did to the Philippines during 2012 with the Scarborough Shoal incident. On the other hand, Vietnam invites international media to come to the field so that they can spread information widely around the world. At the same time, Vietnam actively asked for the voice from the international community. As a result, Vietnam has maintained its war against the threats of invasions by China, Great Drone tactics in 2014. That is the experience from the past. So in the future, the strategy of Vietnam to respond to Great Drone tactics is continue. Right now, at least 4 Chinese ships is intruding illegal into Vietnam's EEZ now. So Vietnam knows that China will continue to use Great Drone tactics to monopolize the South China Sea. Therefore, Vietnam's upcoming strategy in combating the Great Drone strategy, which has in terms of diplomacy, Vietnam continues to clearly demonstrate its key role in action to negotiate the COC effectively, substantively, and in accordance with international law. The COC must be legally binding. We do not build artificial of entities, do not block ship carrying supplies or rotate the personnel, or not establish an air defense identification zone, does not threaten to use of force when settling dispute in the South China Sea. And Vietnam continue to strengthen cooperation with many power in the region and around the world, especially in the field of sharing intelligence, providing means and equipment to protect sovereignty over sea and islands. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can see China used water cannon to fire to Vietnam ships. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. And China used the ship Ramo. Yeah, thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah. So Vietnam always called to use peaceful solution to resolve dispute on the South China Sea. So maybe in the Vietnam solution, Vietnam can use legal solution. So I think that Vietnam want to prepare document to bring China before an arbitral tribunal like the Philippines did. If China continue to trace Vietnam on Vietnam's EEZ in the future. Yeah, so that is some strategy of Vietnam to respond to China's regional tactics on the South China Sea. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Huang, for your presentation and reviewing and letting us know the 2014 oil rig incidents and the extent to which how Vietnam applied measures to counter China's aggression. So we have about 15 minutes left. And as you all were speaking, we're taking questions from the participating audience. So let me read the first question. I think the first question is for Admiral Kawano. It is from Mr. Granusham. He's asking, what are the prospects for Japan establishing direct security ties with Taiwan? Recent statements by the Japanese officials regarding Taiwan are good, but what will Japan do in concrete terms to support Taiwan militarily? Admiral Kawano, please. You should unmute your microphone.
Nowadays, I have no military relationship officially between Japan and Taiwan. So, but I have so exchange information between the intelligence section, just only. So the Japan and the Japanese forces will rear two-star generals to send to Taiwan to attend the intelligence meeting. But I would like to enhance the status of the military relationship, including operational area, because U.S.-Japan summit meeting says the importance and peace and stability of Taiwan Strait is quoted. So after that, we should proceed the defense relationship between Taiwan and Japan. So I'm very much expected.
Thank you very much. We have a second question from Dr. Adam Bartley from Australia. He's asking, can the panelists envisage a new regional security architecture aimed at responding to the gray zone threats? And I would like to add to that question that all the panelists spoke about increased level of collaboration. So what do you see how that would happen, and what are the challenges that you think facing establish such connection? So may I have Admiral Ellis take a crack at the questions?
Thank you. It's a great question, and we've already talked about Quad and maritime cooperation. It's an interesting phenomenon. In the most recent meeting of the Quad, the virtual session, in the statement that was released afterwards, there was one word that did not appear in that statement, and that word was China. And so we have to be careful not being led to play the game the way that China would have us play, ramming ships and attacking with water cannons, as our colleague from Vietnam has just demonstrated. There are lots of other ways in which we can collaborate and cooperate economically, societally, and the like. And so I think it's very, very important that those exercises do take place, that they demonstrate that we can deliver on capabilities, that there are humanitarian roles. The most recent initiative out of the Quad on COVID vaccination is a good example. There are things that we can do that speak well to our values, that speak well to our capabilities, that speak well to the things that we see in common and that we share in common, without getting unnecessarily and inappropriately confrontational with the Chinese. So that's the way I would interpret it. The purpose of the Quad is not to, quote, contain China, in my view. The purpose is to show that democracies in the region can collaborate and flourish collectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ellis. Admiral Ong, would you like to take a stab at the question as well? Because you also mentioned the joint patrol by ASEAN navies in the South China Sea and working with the U.S. Navy and Quad and EU countries.
Well, that's a long way to go. Actually, that's the center of my current study now, looking at minilateralism within ASEAN as a possible approach to mitigate the restrictions of ASEAN centrality and its encumbrances. Okay. With your initial question, maybe you can revisit the new southbound policy of Taiwan itself, and maybe those are avenues for engagements that are non-kinetic in nature and doesn't convey the idea of confronting China. But just the same, it would increase collaboration in other areas besides defense among the relevant countries.
Excuse me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a second part of Dr. Bartley's question about the ASEANs. He's asking at what stage do members of ASEAN eschew risk avoidance in the face of ever-diminishing return to the policy stance? Admiral, would you like to say a few of your comments regarding that question?
I think ASEAN, individually as states, it's trying to hedge with the current situation vis-a-vis the U.S., vis-a-vis China, and the environment that the relationship with two great powers create within Southeast Asia. So given that, they're trying to find a way to maintain the peace in the best way they can, I think. But not necessarily with the outcome that we desire. I mean, given the stack of cards that's laid out right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ong. Next question comes from Nora Wang from the Prospect Foundation, and her question is for Admiral Ellis and Admiral Kawano. She asked, just a few days ago, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter patrolled near and through Taiwan Strait along the U.S. Navy ships. Would it be able to provide deterrence against Chinese maritime gray zone coercion? Admiral Kawano?
So, but we didn't send a ship to going through the Taiwan Strait for Japan. But Japanese government very much hesitate to send a Japanese ship to go straight Taiwanese Strait because it's very much stimulating to China. So so not yet, but I think Japan should send a ship to go through the Taiwan Strait to deter the Chinese illegal activities.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ellis.
I think it's worth remembering that freedom of navigation is one of the basic rights of all of us who share the maritime domain, and exercise of those rights is important. As you all know, but many don't. These freedom of navigation acts were not invented over the last decade. They've existed for many decades, and most nations do them, sometimes even against friends and allies, where there are claims that have not been adjudicated or they're in dispute. And so I wouldn't read too much into that, but I do think that the presence of a collective effort, as has already been described by my colleague Admiral Long, has an influence all its own, and when you can reveal inappropriate behaviors, when you can document it, when you can play it out in the court of law with films and movies, as our colleague from Vietnam has just done, I think that shapes public opinion, and it shapes in some ways behavior. You may not see it directly, but people don't like to be portrayed as bullies or violators of international law, and I think that's the way in which we need to proceed, not in a sense of confrontation, but in exercising the rights that are freely available to all who share the seas.
Thank you very much, Admiral Alice. I want to take the last few minutes to thank all the panelists for joining us on the third panel on strategies to respond to China's gray zone tactics in the South and East China Sea, and sharing your valuable experience. And we know that there's going to be more work ahead of us as China, starting September 1st, tomorrow, require a range of vessels to report their information to China. So I don't know if that will erode the ability to maintain UNCLOS and those influence the countries that are honoring UNCLOS. But it just demonstrates to us that there's issues and more work in the future for us. But I want to thank all of you for joining us on this panel, and thank you so much for凯達格蘭Forum for inviting the esteemed speakers to share their experience with us. Thank you so much, sirs.